Okay, so I'm going to try to weave the L board article into this because it actually is a lot more connected than it seems. But today we're going to I'm going to start talking about marriage and the family. So I wanted to give a little bit of context to marriage and the family, and then we will probably, taking the last, this morning's class as the example, we'll probably not get to talking about the article itself, so we'll talk about both of the articles for marriage and family on next Monday. So we'll have presentations on Wednesday and Friday. But before I leap in, so any questions for me about the presentations coming up, anything else coming up? By the way, in case you didn't notice, it says economic sociology is one of the discussions that got cut. So we had more, I removed that section of the class to make room for presentations for people because there's enough of us in here. For each of us to be able to present, I had to bump off some of the readings. So we took those off. So if you were wondering what that was about, and if you were confused by that, that's why. If you end up posting something there, I'll make sure you get you'll get the points. Otherwise, for that week, I'm just going to give everybody the 5 points. So you'll just get it without actually having to write the discussion. So, any questions though? Well, everyone, yeah.
The presentations on Wednesday and Friday of this week?
For this week, and it's going to be on the basis of the schedule that's posted. So most of you won't go this week. Most of you will go next week or the following class period after that.
So you'd let us know when?
It's on the schedule.
Okay.
So the schedule is posted under content. So yeah, make sure you know when you're supposed to present. And just to reiterate, both for everybody here and a handful of people who can make it, attendance is mandatory, both either in person or on Blackboard Collaborate. So if you're on quarantine or something like that, I will have Blackboard Collaborate going. We may have to have some presenters. There's some people for sure, because they have online exemptions, are going to have to do it via Blackboard Collaborate. So we'll have some presentations done that way if you go on quarantine. If people have been using Blackboard Collaborate in their other classes, it's pretty easy to present because you just do like, well, if you wanted to do more, not do a PowerPoint, you could but then you can just share your screen if you want to. Students can share their screens just as easily as the professors can. And we'll make sure that happens, but if you guys need that. So don't worry about that if that's something that has to occur.
What's the presentation supposed to be on?
Your paper.
Oh, paper.
Yeah, so you're presenting your term paper. And that's 5 to 10 minutes. Okay. So if you're under 5, you lose points. If you're over 10, you just get cut off, but you don't necessarily lose any points. So, and just, we will do it kind of the style you do it at conferences. So everybody will present, we'll hold for Q&A until the end, and then all the presenters will stand up, and then we'll do a Q&A. And make sure that when you guys are listening to people's presentations, it just is this is a good polite thing to do as you guys move into whatever professional arena you move into. It's really nice to make notes about questions to ask while they're speaking. That way you can engage with them after the fact. And often the Q&A is more fun than the presentations themselves at a conference. So try to get into the spirit of that, support your speakers, make them feel welcome. Yeah.
Is there a dress code for presentations?
No. You guys are all going into different professions. Different professions have different standards. So no, there isn't a specific dress code. I mean, in my own profession, I've seen people go up and present in a t-shirt and Carhartt overalls and dreadlocks. So it just depends on what you belong to. So any other questions? Okay, I'm going to leap into talking about, a lot of the things that we talk about in sociology, we have a tendency to view them somewhat transhistorically, like we've been talking about. You guys remember that word, transhistorical? We have a tendency not to view things through time and space. Families is not an exception to this. So our way of understanding family is largely driven by the time and place we live in. And we actually practice really rare types of families if we're talking about historically or geographically. In particular, we have a tendency to have nuclear families on the basis of something called love match marriages that are actually super rare. So we're going to take a while and just sort of reflect upon some of the different ways that people do mate selection and some of the different ways in which people envision their families, who they're related to. So that's kind of the major purpose for today. A lot of this is going to be kind of terminology as well. So to get us kind of kicking off, we'll start with how many people have a tendency to be married to. So how many people are people married to in the United States and in the West for the most part? Is that necessarily true? Can you be married to more than one person in the United States? Wait, yeah, you hit it, right? What did you say?
Divorce, you can get remarried.
Yeah, so there's, so traditionally the West has practiced monogamy. Monogamy being that you are allowed one marriage. Only if somebody dies are you allowed another. You may be able to get divorced. Traditionally in the West you can get divorced, you just can't get remarried. So that's how monogamy works. It's not what we practice today. What we practice today is what anthropologists would call, and a lot of this is coming out of anthropology, by the way, serial monogamy. Right? So we have serial monogamy, meaning that we move from one monogamous relationship to another. A lot of times our serial monogamy starts even before we're married. So what kind of intimate relationships do a lot of people get engaged in before they're married? Dating. Dating is also a form of mate selection, right? So in a lot of ways, like when we practice strictly monogamy, were you technically allowed to, technically speaking, at least allowed to date? Was dating something that was really common earlier in the West? No, because you didn't practice the same form of mate selection. So dating goes along with serial monogamy. So most of us in our lifetime, right, just statistically speaking, even most people who are religious, right, regardless, right, in our Western culture, will at least have several partners, people that they date or marry, right? But you're not really supposed to have them, and this is why it's called serial. You're not really supposed to have more than one at once, right? If you date multiple people and you have actually supposed to have a tight, intimate relationship with that person, generally it's frowned upon in our culture, right? So we have serial monogamy. What could some of the other arrangements be? Because we're not sure, these are both common. Actually, serial monogamy is a little rare. It has a tendency to go along with modernity. Moderns practice it and beyond, no one else, for the most part. How many other people could you be married to? You could be married to more than one person. Does anybody know a term for that? Polygamy. There's multiple kinds of polygamy. Polygamy is very common worldwide still. Not very common in the West. We associate this with what religious group in the U.S. usually? Yeah, particularly Mormons before they became the Church of Jesus Christ and Latter-day Saints. Traditional Mormons, and there's some splinter groups within Mormons that practice polygamy. Is anybody familiar with another religious group that practices multiple marriages?
Well, I was going to say, like, back in King David, he was married to, he had multiple wives.
Oh, yeah, so you're talking about like Old Testament?
Yeah, Old Testament Jewish.
Yeah, that's not an uncommon. It's actually like having multiple spouses is not uncommon, anthropologically speaking. This is very common. It's arguably more common than monogamy. Especially if you take it in total, like any form of it. So the ones we're familiar, is anybody familiar with a different religion that has a tendency to allow for multiple marriages? Islam, yeah, Islam. You're allowed to have, usually depending on the branch of Islam, usually up to 4 wives in Islam. So we're mostly familiar in the West, but most of the time when we think about it being one person married to what? Multiple wives. We have a tendency to think of a version of polygamy called polygyny. What's the other arrangement you could have? This is not an exhaustive list.
Open relationship?
Oh, you could have open. Yes. Yes, that is arguably a modern thing. There are examples that sometimes anthropological literature will get into. Eskimos have something kind of like a traditional Inuit Eskimos had a tendency to have something like an open relationship. Not quite. Interesting, yeah. This is still not an exhaustive list. What else could you have? So this is multiple women, one man. What else?
You have one woman and multiple men.
Yeah. Yeah, a little less common, but it does happen. So this is generally referred to as polyandry. The most common form of polyandry is fraternal polyandry, which is a spin-off version, and that's basically when one woman marries somebody, she marries all of her husbands, or all of his brothers. And this is actually like really common in societies where they don't want to break up, property rights, particularly herders, right? So like you think about like if you're herding animals, you may have massive tracts of land, more than you can use. You have a tendency not to want to break up like the land ownership so you can graze across them, right? So people will practice fraternal polygyny. One place that's pretty common is in Tibet. Tibetan people historically had very commonly practiced fraternal polygyny. And there is fraternal polyandry. There is sororal polygyny sometimes. Anyone want to guess what that is? Yeah, it's essentially you marry somebody, you marry all their sisters. So that happens. Okay, so in one way we can talk about these things as being, and this goes for, this is very similar to what we talked about when we talked about gender. It's very similar to other forms of marriage. Or other forms of family organization that we're going to talk about still today. Human behavior is very fluid around it, but it's not open. And this is a really important distinction. It's fluid, but not open. Usually these sort of practices are regulated by traditions, or they're regulated by the religion that's being practiced, or they're regulated by both. So these are not open things. It's not like, generally speaking, in other parts of the world or in other times, people got to sit around and be like, you know what? I think I'm going to practice fraternal polyandry. People didn't do that, right? Instead, this was sort of a prescriptive thing that was commonly done, right? Does that make sense? In their societies, this is tradition. Monogamy is an aberrant influence from the outside that they have a tendency sometimes, at least initially, to be hostile to, even though increasingly societies have adopted as a form of is a form of marriage. So, but polygamy is still to this day very common, specifically if we're talking about the Middle East or parts of sub-Saharan Africa or North Africa, very common. As our article looked at, right, that we're going to talk about later. Any questions on arrangements with the number of people that you are married to or have made selections? So very cool. Another way in which we see a lot of variety is in what's referred to as I'm going to say this wrong, I'm going to say it wrong. Consanguinity. Consanguinity. It's a hard word to get out. At least for me. And that is how you decide who you're related to. So we have a tendency to practice something called bilateral descent. And so it's a really hard word to say for some reason. It's the GU in the middle. It just throws me every time. Okay, so we practice bilateral descent. And people who study marriage and the family for a long time were really obsessed with mapping out different types of marriages. And they usually have this system, I'm going to kind of use it, where they use a combination of triangles and circles. So circles being female, triangles being male. Or I could say it's very phallic. It kind of is. Okay. So you start here, right? And so 2 people. We're going to do this monogamously. It would get really confusing if we did it any other way. But 2 people. As then it would be confusing for me to draw. Get married. They have kids. Let's say they have 3 kids. Circle, diamond. Actually, let's do 4. Right, and then this person gets married. This person gets married. Right, they have kids. So let's say you are. Let's say you're this person. Who are you related to in this chart? So these are your parents. This is your father's sister. This is your father's brother. This is your father's brother's wife. This is their children. Who are you related to?
Everyone.
You're related to everyone. This is not always true. Actually, bilateral descent is not all that common. Usually people practice either matrilineal or patrilineal descent. Historically, the Western countries practiced either bilateral or patrilineal. So it's a little more common historically, even though if we're talking about space rather than time, it breaks down a little. So most, and there's a couple other forms, but most of them are patrilineal or matrilineal. So let's say you practice, let's say, this side will be patrilineal. You will be related to your father, but you may not be related to your mother in a patrilineal line of descent. You may or may not be related. You will not be related to any of her relatives. So if you are related to your own mother, you won't be related to your mother's brothers, your mother's brother's children, or your mother's parents.
How does that work?
What do you mean?
If we get, what is it, 12 chromosomes from our mother and 12 from our father, how can I not be related to my mother?
You're not related socially. And we're going to see, like, we understand families as existing for very different reasons. And we're going to wind our way up to that today. We have a tendency to view families as existing for emotional support or something like that. Most societies, they view families as something that you gain resources from and have rights and privileges towards, as well as responsibilities. This is a very different system for most people. There's no expectation that any of these people are the people you're going to be closest to. Just because you're technically not related in lines of descent to your mother, doesn't mean that that's not like your favorite person on earth, but your favorite person on earth could be like somebody down the road in your village, and that's perfectly acceptable. In our own culture, that's not, right? So familial relationships and emotive relationships are really tied up in one another, right? Not necessarily true in other cultures. So you wouldn't be related to any of them. Patrilineal is flipped, by the way. So you are related to, and let's take for this one, you're a daughter, right? And in this case, you will be related to your mother. You might not be related to your father, right? You'll be related to all these people, but you won't be related to any of your father's relations. You're actually often your nearest, and you may live with these people in both systems, right? Your nearest male relative in a matrilineal, also likely where you're going to live, is with your mother's brother, who actually serves the function, and particularly this was true in some sub-Saharan African cultures before Western influences. Your mother's brother would have been like your father, and you would have lived with your aunt and your uncle.
So this is basically saying that like you're related to your either the matrilineal or the patrilineal is saying you're related to your mother's social class or your father's social class, not the other.
Yeah, basically, yeah. I would drop the word class because class usually means hierarchy. Okay. But like, you're generally related to that social group. Yeah. So those are the people you're related to, which also gets to like how things will pass down generation after generation. So like, if you exist in a matrilineal line of descent, your father dies, you inherit nothing from your father, which is one of the reasons why you live with your mother's brother sometimes, right? So this has to do with how often possessions pass down. Something that's really important in pre-modern societies. Also things like, a lot of times what profession you'll do is tied in with this. So like, if your mom's family are, I don't know, farmers, and your dad's family are herders, and you're in a matrilineal line of descent, you'll be a farmer, not a herder. Right? Does that make sense? So like a lot of these things become really important in pre-modern societies in a way that they're just not for us. But who you're related to is a big question. Okay. So keeping in mind all that, I'm going to add another difference. Another major difference has to do with rules. We're going to kind of shift back to marriage now. It has to do with rules of who you can and can't marry. So all societies, including our own, have what are referred to as rules of endogamy and exogamy. We're no longer in that. That word meaning who you're related to. Endogamy, exogamy. It's supposed to be an O. Endogamy and exogamy. These are rules. So endogamy is how close you have to be, basically. In other words, they're people you have to marry within. Rules of exogamy is how far people you have to marry outside of. Okay, rules of exogamy are probably the easiest to get into. Is there anyone you specifically can't marry in the United States? What's that?
Siblings.
Siblings!
Except in New Jersey.
What's that?
Except in New Jersey.
Except in New Jersey?
Yes.
I've-
Incest is illegal in Mississippi and Alabama, but it is legal in New Jersey. Fun fact over
New Jersey. Anyone here from New Jersey? It's always the place I dread driving through. It's like the big traffic that surrounds New York City, right? Anyways, so, okay, siblings. Yeah, you're not usually allowed to marry your siblings. Who else? Parents. These two are pretty universal. So, like, I don't say things are universal very often. I'm very afraid of transhistoricals. Pretty much every culture has this. For these. So generally you have to marry outside of the group of your immediate family. Who else can't you marry in the United States? Or I guess like have relations with in general?
Someone who's younger than 18.
Oh yeah. Not that common. Not that common even 150 years ago in the West. You know, my great-grandmother was 14 when she married a 30-year-old man, and the first kid before she was 16. Right?
He was 30.
He was 30, she was 14. Very common in big farm families at one time. He finally inherited the farm, he could get married, right? Okay, yeah, that's a good one, yeah. So there's a rule that not everybody follows. Still to this day, not everyone follows, right? We could get into a whole thing with children and whether 14-year-olds are adults or not in other cultures, like even if they're not in ours. It's a whole big question in and of itself. Okay, other rules of endogamy. What else aren't we allowed to marry?
Cousins, aunts, uncles.
Yeah, cousins, aunts, uncles. I'm gonna stick with cousins. Not a very common term, endogamy. And actually one that's cultural in the for Westerners, not biologically driven. We have a tendency to think if you marry your cousin, you'll have like flipper kids. It's not true. It's completely false. In fact, a lot of cultures practice something called cross-cousin marriages, where you have to marry a cousin. Like it could be a second cousin or a third cousin, but you have to marry, and you can marry your first cousin. It's very common in cultures that are who care more about maintaining internal links than trying to move outside of them. Has no effect on you genetically, but it is super common. But for us, like in the West, it creeps us out. It's a thought, right? It creeps me out as a thought, even though I'm standing up here saying you could do it. Technically speaking, right? And it wouldn't really be a problem. It may be a problem here because you'd get arrested. But nonetheless, it's a rule of exogamy that is culturally specific to Western countries. And a lot of times with groups, yeah, you have to marry outside of. It could be that you have to marry outside some sort of clan group to marry into another clan. It could be, you know, that you have to marry. This is common with aristocrats. So a lot of times aristocrats had to marry outside of their own country if they were high enough, right? That way they could solidify ties with somebody of equal rank. Those are all rules of exogamy. Okay, endogamy. There's certain groups of people you have to marry within. Culturally speaking. A lot of these are more latent in the US. So, these are, if we think about people that your parents might be really upset if you brought them home. I think you're kind of getting on the latent versions of rules of endogamy, right? So what groups, who might you bring home that your parents would be upset about?
Alcoholic,
What's that?
an alcoholic person.
Yeah, that would work, right? Like, you have to marry within, you know, I guess like people without having some sort of addiction, right? I'm guessing your parents wouldn't like heroin addicts any more than alcoholics.
Probably not. I haven't asked, but, like, I haven't asked them, but I think, I get the feeling that.
The feeling, yeah. We would a lot of people, if their parents brought somebody home, if you brought somebody home radically outside your social class, they might be offended by it, right? They might be upset. Usually, you know, they might not be good enough for you, right? Which is exactly this sort of, it's a rule of endogamy. We have a tendency not to marry across classes in the United States.
Well, up until like the 20th century, or not 20th, yeah, 20th century, was race was a big one.
Yeah, that used to be codified by law until, in some states, until the 60s. You know, so you were, yeah, so that's not, that's a pretty common rule of endogamy. I think even still to this day, latently it is one. I think that a lot of people's parents still to this day would be offended if you did that, right? Depending on what culture or part of the United States you come from, culture within it. Yeah, all those are, or you can think about things like, you should generally marry somewhere in your general age range, right? It wouldn't be illegal for any of you to marry an 88-year-old man or a 95-year-old woman, but do you think your parents would be super geeked about it if you did it? Probably not, right? It's an endogamy rule. So we have them as well. So every culture has different taboos surrounding who you should and shouldn't date or marry. Another big difference, and now we're getting into kind of unique things that point out, so all these things, it shows that fluidity, that there's a lot of change over time. So it ends up kind of being like, what form of marriage is traditional? Well, if you're thinking in a long enough worldview, or you're thinking large enough geographically, a whole lot of things are. Here's one that is uniquely Western. How do we pick our spouses? How do you go about finding somebody if you're going to get married, if you decide to get married? How do you go about finding somebody? How do you make the choice? What's our ritual? Yeah, you start by dating people. How's that selection usually done? Do you call random phone numbers in the phone book?
Well, like, figure out what your type is.
What's that?
You figure out what your type is.
Your type. What do we mean by that? A type. No, that's a good place to take us. But what do we mean by it? Let's be specific. What do we mean by that? What do you think?
Personality.
What's that?
Personality.
You base it off of the person. What were you gonna say?
I was going to say something.
You gotta base it off whether you're attracted to people, right? Because like your type might not be like somebody who's actually like you, right? Like it might be somebody who's actually quite different from you. It might not even be somebody you mesh well. A lot of people are attracted to and marry people that they don't particularly link up with very well, right? We have a tendency to, we practice something called, more broadly, called love match marriages. Are you supposed to marry somebody you're not in love with? In our culture. Do people generally, like, when you do it, do you guys, how many people in here would be comfortable with a marriage of convenience? Like, you just get along well enough and you want to pool your resources. Does that make people? No, you're supposed to fall in love with people. Right? That's how we're supposed to make the decision. I mean, falling in love is a very emotive way of making a decision. decision about who you marry, right? Are you supposed to marry somebody if you talk well, but you don't actually fall in love with them? Is that something that you're supposed to do really culturally? You just good buddies like to hang out? I mean, things might go better for us if we did, I think. But like, nonetheless, right? Like, so it's built off of this sort of emotive thing. How do people in other cultures, because this is rare and it's very Western, and it's not very old. Initially, actually, the idea of love grows out of like, basically like books of like this was like the Romance era of writing in the like Middle Ages. So in the West, it originally grows off of basically just things to describe illicit affairs on your spouses. You weren't supposed to be in love with your spouse. You were supposed to be in love with the person you cheated on him with. Sort of courtly romance stuff, and then eventually it sort of migrates into being something that you're supposed to feel for your spouse. So it's pretty new, and it's pretty novel. How do most societies choose their spouses?
Usually, like set arranged marriages based upon like culture or wealth. Like a wealthy would marry a wealthy, somebody with high culture status, and marry somebody else with high culture status.
Yeah, generally speaking, their marriages are arranged. You hit on some things. What are some of the reasons? What's some of the impulses behind arranged marriages? So, what are some of the things that determine who marries who in an arranged marriage?
Well, going back to medieval ages, sometimes kings would marry off their daughters or sons. That way, two kingdoms would come together for peace or something.
Yeah.
Dividing land.
Yeah, that's very common. Allegiances. You marry to create familial ties. Thinking about those lines of descent and the sort of other systems, like we're working our way to as well, like other systems of kinship are very much so about extended families. We're very much so not. And so in those systems, often like marriage is a way of cementing ties across or within your society, regardless of how large or small that is. So even if you're a society of like, a couple hundred people, you may, still want to cement, within that versus go outside of it. But generally, yeah, often that is. It's even more common amongst upper classes and various sorts of societies, creation of allegiance. What else might be a reason why people arrange their marriages?
For stability, like financial stability.
Yeah. So that's a good one as well. Yeah, for resources, access to resources. That kind of deals with this too, because like to some degree, like you make decisions on the basis of the ability to obtain resources. Who do we live with when we get married in the U.S.? Who's in your household when you're married?
Spouse.
Your spouse?
Kids.
Kids, when and if you have them. Do you think that's common? No, a lot of times like you move into some sort of extended household, right? You may not, in a lot of societies, you might not be able to own resources or own property until your parents pass away. A lot of times people don't have property rights in a lot of societies at all, unless they're heads of households. So like, you might, So yeah, it's a very different situation that you're moving into. What would be something, so if you think about like, if rather than moving into an apartment or house with your spouse, you instead had to move into a household of, say, your spouse's parents, their brothers and sisters, their brothers and sisters' wives, their kids, maybe some uncles and aunts. What might be a very different thing you'll consider?
It might become very important to really like your in-laws, like a lot more.
Yeah, that's actually a big thing in arranged marriages, is a lot of times in arranged marriages they think about fit in the family. So So they're going to think about, and this is particularly true of people who do arranged marriages as adults rather than arranged school cultures where you have adult arranged marriages. A lot of times what you'll get is basically they will, they'll interview people and then they'll make a decision of who's going to fit in. Do you have a question? Get your hand up.
I was just going to ask, like, when you were talking about, like, a lot of people don't have land or didn't have land.
Yeah.
If they're married, like, them to have, like, I don't say life support, but kind of not, because you get married so that way you have a place to stay, a place to eat, a place to grow up in, and after your spouses or your parents pass away, you inherit the land, and then you have your kids and something like that.
Yeah, resources are very important in other forms. I think actually you see that popping up in our article on polygamy as well, right? Is like resources are often very important determinants of what kind of families people practice, but also like what they do within those. Yeah, so I think that is a big thing. What's another thing? So like let's envision let's say your parents were going to marry you off. What do you think they're going to think about when they try to select somebody for you? This is something we don't normally think about because we're sort of raised with this sort of Disney fear of arranged marriages. Have you ever noticed a lot of Disney shows that revolve around arranged marriages? It's really kind of like, considering that like it's a very common form of marriage, it's a little hostile towards people in other places. What do you think your parents might want to think about?
Social class? Social status?
No, I'm thinking like your own parents. Like if your own parents are making this choice, what would they care about?
You think they'll try to choose someone who will treat you well?
Sorry, I do W in my own notes for with. So, yeah, a lot of times we're going to think about the fit, your fit with your spouse, right? The spouse's fit, rather than just a family fit. In a lot of societies, too, this isn't a binary thing. So in a lot of societies, parents will arrange a marriage, and then people will be able to essentially have the ability to veto it. For a long time, that's what it was in the West. So people couldn't be forced to be married. This is particularly like in the 19th century. It was still very common to have arranged marriages in the West, but people could essentially veto it. This was very common in parts of India today, where essentially like your parents will arrange a marriage, but then you meet the person and you could be like, no, I'm not going to do it. And then they'll have to find somebody else for you. But the idea isn't that like you immediately make a love connection, but you can get some feeling about whether you get along, right? And so essentially like if you think you can get along with that person, you sort of trust in the person who did the arranging. Sometimes it's not your parents that arrange, sometimes it's a matchmaker too. This is particularly common for societies where you have rules of endogamy that tell you you have to go outside of your own town. This isn't uncommon, so like in a lot of like larger tribal networks, you'll get where basically within your village you can't marry. And so there'll be somebody who crossed over at some point and then serves as a matchmaker and will draw ties to other communities, right, having known the people. It's not super uncommon. Those are some really common amongst Jewish populations in Eastern Europe at one time. Yeah, some matchmaking arrangements. Okay, so getting back to it, right, like a lot of the things we think of as very natural are not really. We're already hinting at this a lot. A lot of this has to do with the difference between extended and nuclear families. And nuclear families are fairly uncommon historically, and not even really all that old in our own society. So there's a really great If you ever wanted to read like a history, a sort of long view history of how families work, probably the one that did it, to actually try to own that as a topic and just sort of like a long view overall, it's an academic history, is Zimmerman. Wrote a book called Family and Civilization. And according to Carl Zimmerman, we often talk about this idea that like families are declining. You guys have heard this idea, right? We talk about the decline of the American family. Carl Zimmerman was like, wanted to look at this phenomenon, but wanted to look at it in a much broader sense. And what he wanted to claim is a lot of the reason why we talk about the decline of the family is what we've actually seen is it's been a couple hundred years since in the West the family has had any of the traditional powers that it had. And this had to do with this shift from an extended family to a nuclear family. So if we're thinking back on what we were looking at, right, you know, we have a tendency to view families as mostly having an emotive function, right, being about connection. A lot of that idea about strong emotions comes from the fact that families wield very little power as political and economic agents anymore. Originally, families served as the predominant form of politics for most of human history. You will have even until you get to large states. So this is until, and that maybe sounds ancient, right? But like, you know, until you get into things like the formation of Greek city-states and things of that nature, these sort of large empires, anything like that. Before that, people pretty much, the political system was pretty much only guaranteed through familial ties. So what I mean by that is like, the only people who govern over you are people you're related to. This is true, so in anthropology, they'll talk about tribes or chiefdoms. These are just different, what we'd call small-scale societies. But all of them, politics, if they have any sort of political form of force or representation, it's solely through the family. And then even much longer in Western history, and we've seen this nodded at a couple times before, our ties into the economy is through our families, right? So what job you have, how you get resources, this is why those lines of descent are so important. So it used to be that the primary agent of politics and economics was actually the family. Only after that dies out do you see the slow disappearance of the extended family, the rise of the nuclear family, and the rise of this idea of it being mostly an emotional institution. So the sort of like ideas and how we talk about families grows from that sort of slow change. Does it make sense? Okay, cool. So that's basically, so I was talking about, I said I was going to pull back to the article again. And this is how I'm going to do it. So the article talks about another anthropologist by the name of Karl Polanyi. Karl Polanyi, right? And the article's talking about something that is referred to, and you saw this word throughout the article, embeddedness. And the claim is that we have a tendency to talk about markets, economic markets, as if we could just remove them from a political context, right? So the idea of like getting the government out of it, right? Getting everything out of it and letting the market be free, right? You've heard that, probably heard that idea. It comes up a lot with austerity and liberalism throughout the class, right? The idea is that basically, how we're thinking about the economy in this instant is as if it was disembedded, as if it was removed from our culture. According to Karl Polanyi, this has never been true, right? Our economy has always been cultural. It was just originally embedded within our families, right? And then over time, as political institutions gained independence from familial networks, it became controlled by politics. right? So as we try to disembed it from politics, usually what happens is then all these weird sort of contradictions and shifts come to the forefront, and that's essentially what that tax story was about, is the attempt to disembed the economy, what resulted from it, and what the reaction of small business owners, people who are still integrated into their community have. Okay, I'm 1 minute over. I told you I would wind my way all the way back to it. I think I tried my best. Okay, so, remember Wednesday starts the presentations. Everyone has to come. I'll see you Wednesday. We'll continue our next round of family stuff on next month. Have a good day, guys.
Sorry. No problem.